Hi, everybody. Dr. Kipp and here. Just wanting to tell you about our Patreon account. If you enjoy the show, please go over to our Patreon account. It's patreon.com/Midwestern. And go ahead and pledge. We actually have some brand new tiers. So if you actually donate $1, you get to be called what we call a GTA, or a graduate teaching assistant. If you do $3, you get to be an official adjunct professor. If you dedicate $5, you are an associate professor. And if you donate the maximum at this time, $10, you get to be, congratulations, you have tenure, a full professor. Yay! So, if you like the show, we want to keep it ad-free. Go to patreon.com/Midwestern and, help us out. Thanks a lot.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Midwestern Social Scientists. This is a Titanic episode 48. I'm your half-host, Keith McIntosh, and I'm here with my friend and esteemed colleague, good friend,
Dr. Kipp and What?
Dr. Kipp and It's nice to see you. How you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm doing all right. Yeah, doing
all
okay.
right? Okay. Well, that's good. That's good to hear. That's good to hear.
Good news to share, Keith. We
do
got
tell.
Our very first Patreon donation.
Our first Patreon. Thank you very much, you angel from above, bestowing how much loot, how much dinero.
I won't reveal his last name, but his first name was Craig. So thank you very much, Craig, for donating to us.
Thank you, Craig.
It's very meaningful. Everybody should follow follow Craig's lead and do the same. We should follow Keith's lead too, because he's a wonderful man as well. But. So Keith, what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, here's the thing. We always have a little, we go back and forth before starting an episode. We pick a fascinating topic, and, we spend about a month doing research into that topic, and we make sure that we're just, extra special. We're experts, I would say, on everything that we talk about.
Definitely.
And and so, anyways, but this episode is a little bit different.
So Keith just had...
My microphone just broke.
A microphone accident. Whoa! So for those that can't see,
yeah, please
Keith,
narrate.
He has this very fancy microphone set up, where he's got like a pop filter and the microphone in front of him. The microphone actually slipped out of the stand, fell straight down, and actually smashed his coffee mug.
But here's the other half of it. The mug that it smashed was a mug that I actually got when I was visiting Mexico. It's from Puebla City in Mexico. And it cracked before, and I super glued it together, and it was slowly breaking. I noticed a crack emerging, and it just got annihilated. And I was also sipping whiskey, but I saved the whiskey. It's still at the bottom of the mug.
We got the important part, of course, I guess.
Do you want to just, we just talk about this. I think I can just
bummer.
I can still use it, I think. I can still use the mug.
Yeah,
like right now.
It does look a little bit like you're shanking yourself in the face. Because you got a picture, this mug is like all cracked up, and I keep calling it Craig now. Oh my God, Keith just slammed it into his face. So
I gotta say, for having my mug just shatter in front of me, I didn't spill much. I think the show can go on.
A couple of things. One, super impressed with your resolve as a man. Keith, you did not jump. You did not usually, when something falls in front of you and it breaks, your natural inclination is to stand up and throw up your arms don't get me wet, And you literally just it's like nothing moved but your pupils. They just watched it fall. That was pretty funny.
That's true. I think I'm a chilled out enough person that sometimes drama happens in front of me, and I just watch it like a movie, and I feel like I cope pretty well.
They used to call that. They used to call
all right,
that
I was
slow, Keith.
well. Thank God we live in social justice times. These enlightened social justice times, where I no longer have to be called slow. I get to be called enlightened
and relaxed. You're a true Buddhist.
So I was on my way to saying we needed to pick a topic, and I thought it would be kind of interesting to make this less, I guess, less topical in the sense that we're not going to be talking about, say, Trump or politics. I thought it would be interesting to talk about your experiences as a counselor, and here's my reasoning. I feel like counselors and therapists are people who seem like modern versions of a kind of like shaman of old times, in that people come to them with their problems and they seek wisdom and guidance and that kind of thing. And yet there's not like, it's not obvious that there are counselors for counselors, or that people whose job it is to sponge up all these, these like problems that everyone else has. I don't know. It seems like there must be a burden in that. And I feel like it's this kind of hidden thing where I never hear counselors talk about how hard it is being a counselor. And it's got to be. And so I just thought it'd be kind of interesting to have a conversation, and you can make it as sort of personal as you want, or you can forget that you're a counselor and you can talk about it in terms of other people's experiences if you want. You can steer the conversation however you please, but I thought that would be an interesting topic for today's show.
And I think it's a great topic and it's interesting, and I'm really curious to see where it's going to go, because it's kind of one of those things. It's like if I were to ask you, Keith, like, explain sociology. It's such a big topic that it's actually like it's almost easier if I like have something specific to kind of move from.
Oh, make it about yourself.
Right.
I see.
To me, it's actually like I'm really excited to kind of see where we end up, starting so big. But I also want to say, just as a preface, that this is just one psychologist's opinion, and that like there are social workers, counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, nurse practitioners. I mean, tons of different people that have different training and are taught differently in how to do counseling. So, don't take my words as gospel, or my experience of counseling as like being universal. So I don't know. I just want to kind of preface that. And
no, that makes sense.
So, okay. Well, let's dive into that. Where do you want to start at?
All right. So I think it'd be kind of interesting to hear you talk a little bit about your first. I'm always amazed when you watch anyone doing something out of the ordinary, even if it's like an athlete performing some action, which like twisting their body in a way that my body can never twist. It looks so natural. It looks so comfortable. It's so easy for them. But it clearly is something that was achieved through years of practice. It's really, in fact, quite artificial. And I wonder if it's got to be artificial at first, an uncomfortable feeling at first, to sit down and talk to somebody who's a stranger to you about their problems. And so I wonder, what was it like for you when you were in graduate school and you first began talking to folks as a counselor?
Well, that's a great question. I think that a lot of people wouldn't recognize that for a novice counselor, the focus is actually highly technical at the beginning. Because
how's that?
When you're getting taught to be a counselor, you're actually being taught a different way of speaking. And people recognize it. Like, you see it on TV, and it's kind of like hey, how's it going? Like, I just want to check in with you and see how you're feeling, right? Like, there's almost like it's like code switching, to turn on the...
It's funny. I've known you since you were 18, I guess. And you do have a way of speaking now that you didn't used to have. Like, and I hear it sometimes on the podcast. Especially if you're going more technical, there's just like a code. I don't know, a certain way of presenting yourself that you have now that did not exist when you were younger.
Yeah. Well, what would you say it's good?
Yeah, I mean it's professional. It's like soft. Whereas like you're like full of energy. So in real life, I feel like you're more. You like raise your voice, you'd be like loud and be like, whatever, vivacious or something, energetic. But this new voice is like very subdued and like more touchy-feely and softer.
Yeah, and I would say that actually when they look at like developing counselors, they find that people's personality kind of like merges with it over time. So like at first, when you're starting to be a counselor, you're very like, okay, I am a counselor now, you know? And as time goes on, your personality kind of integrates a little bit more naturally. So you're
That's really interesting.
yeah, you're kind of being more yourself in the therapy room, as opposed to being being like a pretend counselor. But anyway, going back to that thing you asked about being a pretend counselor, like it does feel artificial, but it's artificial in not that I'm pretending to be like Sigmund Freud or something like that.
Yeah.
It's artificial in that I'm I'm struggling with listening to what you're saying because I'm trying to formulate an intervention internally, which I have been taught. And so there's no smoothness to it. It's like very clunky. You know,
Yeah.
I almost think about like if you watch somebody play basketball for the first time and they're like going up for a layup and they're like trying to lift their leg and lift their right arm. You know, they teach you like it's like like a marionette doll. You know, like lift your leg and lift your arm. Versus if you watch like LeBron do a layup, it's like so smooth and natural. You know, so when you're first being taught to be a counselor, there's a lot of focus on like, okay, like use what we call micro skills, which are like reflection statements and summary statements. And
What does that mean? Like, what's an example of like a reflection statement?
so a reflection statement would be what you're giving to me, Keith. So what you're saying to me, I am going to either reflect the content back to you, which is like if you were to tell me, oh yeah, you know, graduate school is really hard, I'm really struggling, I have my candidacy exam coming up, I would say something along the lines of like, so what I'm hearing is that you're really having a hard time pursuing this graduate degree. And so it would be like, that's like a more content-based one versus a more like process-based one, or process meaning kind of feelings or interpersonal. I would say something like, oh, it sounds like you're really frustrated. You know, so I'm
But then
pulling...
you're sort of projecting. Well, you're doing your best to guess what they're feeling, and then they can, I guess, reject that or accept it.
Right, and that's kind of like we're looking for signals that we're doing a good job. So when somebody if I say like, "Oh, you sound like you're really frustrated," and you're like, "Yes," that's like a signal that I'm on the right track. Versus if you're like, "Well, kinda, I'm actually feeling more sad or depressed," you know, then that kind of. So there's a lot of internal dialogue going on where you're like, "Okay, here we go. I'm going to use the summary statement." Okay, here we go. I'm going to use the reflection statement. Or here we go. I'm going to challenge the client, you know.
Did you start with like practicing with other students, other psychology students?
Yeah, well, that's actually a really cool question. You start off by role playing, but at least in my program, you start off by role playing, but you're actually role playing with your real problems.
Really?
Yeah, so in my program, it wasn't like, oh, make up a problem. It was like, okay, like we're going to pair you two up. You're going to go into this room. The rest of the class is going to watch you through a one-way mirror.
Really?
And you're actually going to, like, that person's going to do counseling with you. You're going to be the client, and you're going to talk about your real life. And it's kind of funny because what you're basically told is like, oh, well, go deep, but don't go too deep. Like as the client. And so it's really interesting. And then the counselor steps out and gets like feedback on how they did.
Yeah.
And then a big part of the beginning process is like you transcribe you actually transcribe your sessions. And so you become very, very familiar with the language you use and the way that you say things in a way that is very unnatural, I would say. And it's actually very disorienting, I would say, at the beginning of your training.
Are there things that you would say that you can remember, like, oh, I should stop saying that?
Yeah. So one thing was I became very aware of how blunt my language often was, and I became very aware of how often I say like. And I remember feeling like when I would read my early transcripts that I sounded like I was from like Irvine, California. Because like it would be like, oh, so then it's like it kind of feels like this, or would you say it's more like this? Like, you know what I'm saying? You know.
Oh, that sounds horrible. So how do you get over that? I mean, you just work on it?
Practice. Yeah, you practice and you watch enough video and it shames you internally enough. It
shames you internally enough.
But then the cool thing, Keith, and not every program does it, but mine does it, and I actually really value this thing, is they make you go into a room with a real client,
Mm-hmm.
except you have a Bluetooth headset in your ear, and a licensed psychologist, and actually in my department, it was actually a team, was giving me feedback while I was working with the client.
Wow.
And so they would, the client was basically getting free therapy, or like the therapy was like $1
Yeah.
or something, because we had to charge for some reason. I can't remember why, but yeah, they would just give us live feedback, and so you'd be sitting there talking, and then you'd like have somebody whispering in your ear, like telling you extra things to do or like ways to go.
That sounds. Was it helpful, or was it like? Did it get in your way? That seems tough.
No, it was extremely helpful. I would say it was. I always think of it. It's like training wheels.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're kind of on your own, but you kind of have like dad behind you, like holding the bike seat.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like if you really screw up, they're gonna help. You know what I mean? They're gonna like interject. And that taught me a lot about what I would call like trajectory of therapy, which is like where I want the client to go, or where I think the client's going to take the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can do a lot of work around like, okay, how do I shape this, or how do I move this so that the client like experiences this conversation in like a corrective way.
Mm-hmm. What is like the first stage when you sit down with a new client? Is the first stage just getting a sense of whatever their problem is and encouraging them to articulate themselves? Like, let's say you're talking to somebody who doesn't have a lot of friends and they don't often get to put their problems into words. Is that like the first thing, is just to have them say it?
Yeah, I mean the first session, we call them sessions. The first session is really, really technical, because I'm spending a lot of time like just getting background information. So it's what we call like a structured interview.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say I was interviewing you for the first time, Keith. I might say like, okay, so your name's Keith McIntosh, and Keith, can you tell me like you go to school? And you'd say like Temple University.
Yeah.
And I'd say, okay, great. And I'd say, and what are you going to school for?
Sociology.
You know, and sociology. And I go, okay, like what do you study in sociology?
Hey,
and so
I don't know.
So so the trick is to also build a relationship while you're doing this very technical thing.
Okay.
And so what I want to do is show genuine interest and like love for the person in that moment. I mean love, and not like I love them.
Yeah,
like,
sure.
But I want to show like a general sense of compassion and caring for them. So if they tell me like, oh, my degree is public speaking, or public policy or public health or something like that, I really want to know like, why do they like it? And like I really want to make them feel like I'm interested in it, that I'm not just waiting for my turn to speak, or I'm not just trying to get my work done.
Yeah.
And the cool thing is when I actually am, that's like the best therapy. So Keith, I actually get super fired up when somebody comes in and they're like a sociology major, because immediately I'm like Durkheim and Marx and Weber and Adorno, and like I start talking about all that stuff, and they can tell that they're like, whoa, you're like really into it, and then that helps build the relationship. Versus if I have to kind of force it a little bit more, I think it comes off a little more forced.
Makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Huh. So what do you remember?
So
I was going to ask you about like your the first time you had the training wheels off and you're working with clients. Do you remember like messing up? Like, were there times where you felt like, oh shoot, I said the wrong thing, I did the wrong thing, and like, how do you deal with that?
Oh geez. Yeah, there's lots of times I can think of like making mistakes, or I wouldn't even say, I mean, definitely times I've made mistakes, or you didn't do the most optimal work that you could do. And so I can think of times where I've said something and then, maybe the client doesn't come back that session, or maybe they come back the next session, but maybe like they kind of fade away after that, And then, but see Keith, and this is where it gets crazy, because this is what makes psychology and like counseling such a weird thing to study, because you're always guessing about what was successful or what was unsuccessful. So like in that situation, let's say a client, like I say something, I think I made a mistake, and then 2 sessions later they stop coming. I might attribute that internally to, oh, that's because I said that thing and I shouldn't have, But the client doesn't come in and they're like, you said that thing and now I'm going to stop coming. So they might have stopped coming because they got a new job,
or they felt like it was helpful,
some,
and maybe the issue they had, they've got some sense of how to deal with it.
right. But you never know that. And so therapists, I think, have a really convoluted world around that. Like a lot of times people will say like, oh, like this is just they might need to come to counseling like 3 or 4 times before they realize like their problem. Or people will say something like, you did some really good work while they were here. And so people kind of have it's funny, these almost like illogical, like cognitive distortion things that they do to justify when they have no control of whether or not, like, why a client didn't come anymore, or the work you did with the client when you maybe missed something that you probably should have dove into more. And that's a big thing, I would say, Keith. It's like one of those early mistakes you can make is like helping the client choose which topic that they actually want to talk about. Because it's rare that somebody comes in with like one specific problem.
Really?
Oh yeah, like I mean, with like some phobias, like if somebody's like, I'm afraid of spiders, that's like actually really easy to work with. But most people come in and they're like, I'm kind of depressed, I don't really know why. Like I'm stressed out, I don't have a lot of friends, or and so it's like, okay, do I focus on helping them make friends, or do I focus on like just the pure depression, the hopelessness? Do I focus on their biological functioning, like them sleeping, their appetite, their energy level? Do I focus on like anxiety, things that are actually stressing them out? So, and then you also want the client to kind of like choose that, but the client maybe doesn't always know.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like what is necessarily stressing them out.
How many
directly,
people come to you for guidance, do you think? Yeah, like how many people do you think really are looking for like, I've got a mysterious problem and maybe you can diagnose it, versus just like a kind of therapy of just talking to somebody, or like
Geez, I'd say about half and half,
okay.
to be honest. I think some people really, and I think cultural background has a big
How so?
influence on that. Like when I work with, for example, people from China, I think that there is definitely a feeling of more like, you're the doctor, tell me what's wrong with me, like diagnose me, tell me what to do, like give me really practical steps. And that's not everybody. That's just like a cultural thing that's it's like well documented in counseling literature, that people from, China and tend to want more like specific advice. And they're highly respectful of like the PhD degree, But then I would say some people do want like that more chill kind of like Big Brother thing, where they're just like, oh yeah, you're just like, I really like coming in and talking to you. I really like connecting with you. Like I really, and they're not really looking for somebody to like tell them what to do necessarily. I'd say actually what's probably the most frustrating, Keith, for a counselor, is, at least me, is when people come in just to vent.
No, that happens.
Oh yeah, like they come in and they kind of they're just like blah 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 blah, like 100 miles an hour, and you're like trying to be like, oh, you try to point out what is causing the same situation to keep happening in the client's life. And I think that they struggle with that a lot, unfortunately. And like, if people like view the purpose of therapy is to like kind of get the venom out,
yeah,
it kind of makes it's not really that helpful, I don't think, always. It's kind of like a Band-Aid,
Yeah, that's tough. It's interesting though, because I think about like, sometimes that's what your friends are for too. You talk to a friend and you just kind of like get the shit out and vent, and like that does feel therapeutic. So I can appreciate why probably some folks assume like, oh, that's what therapy's about. Like it's just an opportunity to like get the stuff off my chest. But it sounds like, I mean, it also makes sense from your perspective. You underwent all these years of education, you put a lot of time and effort into it, and you have like real knowledge and expertise. So it's probably a little bit, maybe not insulting, but not super gratifying if someone is just like venting and then they peace out.
Yeah, and I don't think it's very effective over time. So for example, if somebody was like traumatized, Keith, the first time they tell that story, like of being like, let's say, sexually assaulted, or they were in a big car accident, or they witnessed something really terrible, or, sudden death of a loved one or whatever, like that, at that time, that is really powerful for them to say it. You know what I mean? But when it comes to like interpersonal stuff, like, oh, you should hear what this person, like what this jerk at work did again.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like you want to, rather than hearing this week's story about the person they hate, you want to help them like move past their hatred for that person or their anger toward that person, rather than every week just giving them that short-term kind of relief, you know? And a big part of it, I think, of therapy is helping people recognize that their interpersonal patterns tend to go across relationships.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. Is it hard to, do you feel like times where you can see that in someone, like weeks or months or before they do, and you try to guide them to it, or do you say it explicitly?
I think you say it explicitly, but you say it with tact, and you say it with grace, and you say it slowly over time. I think if somebody comes in and I come at them with something like some really heavy interpersonal feedback, immediately they're going to go like, this is terrible and that's stupid and you're not even on my side. But if they feel like they trust you and they feel like you care about them and you kind of slowly introduce that feedback, I think people tend to respond pretty well. So like a kind of a classic one is if people like have a sense, whenever they feel like somebody's not there for them, they get like a sense of abandonment. And so they kind of react really harshly. So they're like, well, screw that person. I'm not texting them anymore. I'm not going to talk to them anymore. Or, well, that person, yeah, they barely ever call me, you know? So they're obviously like a bad person. Or like they didn't invite me to that party. And so like, you know, you could just listen to that stuff, but what you want to tell the person is like, yeah, so it feels like every time somebody's not like available to you, this sense of anger comes up. And then that, rather than acknowledging like the underlying hurt, you know, they just do the anger. And so venting the anger is never going to get rid of that problem. You're just going to keep, because the hurt is the bigger thing. So you try to help them acknowledge that hurt and then also recognize that their emotions are skewing their view of reality. You know, just because somebody didn't text you doesn't mean they don't want to be your friend or they hate you. But if you start like being angry with them, of course, they're going to be like, you're like, why are you angry with me? I didn't do anything. Like, I didn't text you, you know?
It takes like a lifetime to figure that shit out. Like, it's really tough to see yourself from the outside looking in because you're not, you know, you're on the inside looking out. And so it's like you kind of build up over a lifetime, hopefully a more sophisticated view. Is it challenging working at a college where everyone you talk to is like a fresh adult, you know, like brand new to the adult realm, you know, 18 to 22? Because it's like they don't have, I don't know, they can't look back at themselves from the perspective of 30 or 40 or 50 or even 25. You know what I mean?
Oh, Keith, that's so funny because they totally do. They think about when they were young and 16 and in high school.
Oh man.
And it's like, no, and let me say this. I love working with college students for the exact reason you just said. Because they're like extremely open. They tend to be like very liberal minded, so they're like open to therapy. They like tend to be like very aware. They're in a very developmentally cool place. Like you can really help them and like when you shift, I think of like it's like a cruise ship. You know, if somebody's like a developing narcissist, for example, the ship starts to turn, right? And it's like if you let that ship go for 20 years, you're way off course. But like when you do college counseling, you have this cool opportunity to kind of shift early on, kind of shift the track amazing. Just enough where, yeah, and that's why I love it. I think it's like the best population to work with, and I've worked with, you know, from children to teenagers to adults. I've worked in nursing homes, you know, so I feel like I've hit the whole like developmental lifespan, and college students are my favorite by far, just because they're so. They like look up to you and they like believe in you and they like value education. So when they know that you have a degree and everything, they're like, whoa, this is important, you know, versus when I used to work with middle-aged people, they're more like, well, I've been doing this for 30 years. I ain't changing, you know? And it's like, you end up kind of hitting these brick wall spots with people because they're just not willing to bend or, you know, their life isn't flexible enough where they can make the substantial changes that they need to, you know, because they go to work and they can't quit their job, you know, versus a student, they can like switch their major, like that,
That's funny. Yeah, that's amazing. I've never heard you say that before, but that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I could totally see why that would be far more gratifying working with college students.
Yeah.
It's got to be a stressful job in general, but I'm wondering like when it's going as well as it ever goes, like what those moments are like the best times that you've had as a counselor where you've got the most gratification from what you do. What does that feel like, and what's that about? What are those circumstances like?
Yeah. I would say the journey from somebody being suicidal to them graduating college
Wow.
is like really powerful.
Yeah.
And I mean, a lot of students will endorse suicide, but I mean somebody who's like truly suicidal and going from that point and like working with them for like, let's say, I get to work with them for like 6 months, and they go from that to like, hey, I'm going to graduate and get a degree. And they start seeing like really practical change, or not practical, I don't want to, very concrete changes in their life because of the work we're doing. So I think of like a lot of like very lonely guys that I've worked with who end up like getting a girlfriend or a partner, and it's because of like the work we've done, or people that were doing really bad in school and now they're getting a good degree in school, or they were doing good in school and then they had like a really bad semester and they became depressed, and then rather than them just like doing worse and eventually leaving school, we like corrected the ship, so they start doing better again, and they go on to graduate school or whatever. I think that that's amazing. I also think when you get somebody to move past something really powerful and traumatic, that makes, I mean, there's times, Keith, where I'll walk out of a session and I just want to like go like run up a mountain or something, because I just feel like, oh my God, like we did, and it's never me, like I never feel like I'm a kick-ass counselor, like I totally rocked that guy's world, or that woman's world, like I always think like, wow, like we together got to like an amazing place today.
Yeah.
And that's like such a beautiful, cool feeling, and it's just, I love to share that with the clients too. I'll tell them, I'll be like, remember when you used to do this? Remember when you used to say that?
Yeah.
And really give them that feedback and show them, because they live it, it's like, like you said, you live in your shoes, but I have these little data points with each person. So I see the trajectory over time. And it's pretty cool. It's really amazing.
That's amazing.
And then I would say that the opposite is like, the dark times, which is like,
yeah, tell me about that.
Like, yeah, and I would say where you feel really inept as a counselor, like you feel like the stuff you're doing is pointless, things are feeling really repetitive in counseling.
Are there issues? Are there issues sometimes that get brought up where it's just like some really heavy stuff that someone has gone through and you don't know if you're like equipped to help them through it? Or do you feel like your training has pretty much given you the tools to deal with any situation?
Oh, Keith, I'll say that almost every week I hear something that I don't feel equipped to deal with. Like, because every trauma is like unique. Every time somebody's sexually assaulted or somebody is, let's say they're molested when they were a kid, or they don't want to live anymore, and they truly don't want to live anymore. When you like go into that darkness with somebody, it's destabilizing, and it makes you look at the world a little bit differently for the rest of the day. At least me, it's like, Keith, like you and I are like pretty decent dudes, right? Like, Keith, like you and I, like, maybe the shittiest thing we do to somebody is like me and you will be like mad at each other, and I'll be like, make a snarky comment to you.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh shit. And then later, like, sorry, dude, I shouldn't have said that, It's like, but then you realize there's like people out there who like, the Harvey Weinsteins of the world, who are just these vindictives, like sociopaths. And the more you hear about how those types of people impact people's lives, it's shocking.
Yeah.
Because you don't, like, I don't know anybody like that. I
Yeah.
don't interact
No, me
with
neither.
anybody
Me
like
neither.
that.
Yeah.
So you hear like, oh my God, this guy, like, like let's say working with like a domestic violence case, that some guy just like punches his girlfriend in the face, and he's done it like 50 times.
Yeah.
And it's like, as a person who's like, never even come close to hitting anybody, let alone like the person I love, so that's what I mean by like, it's like destabilizing almost. You're like, what? Like, I can't believe that happens,
Yeah.
So I feel ill-equipped to deal with that because I have no personal experience. But again, it's not really about me. Like, I'm just like helping the client deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think of it like, I have all the skills to like help this. I think of it as like, I'm there to sit with them and be with them.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have to have like I don't have to be like, I know the secret psychological thing that helps you here.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times it's just sitting there listening to them and like helping them explore it, which is just being curious,
Mm-hmm.
And asking the questions that maybe other people wouldn't ask because they don't want to be rude,
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that's helpful. I don't know if I kind of got off track.
No, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. Do you feel like most people come to see you partially because there are things that no one in their life will ask them and things that they can't really say to anyone else, so they need to like kind of go to a stranger and have this like special time where they can open up to some of that stuff?
Yeah. So Keith, yeah, definitely. I think one thing is the number one thing that I hear in counseling when it relates to that is, I don't want to be a burden on everybody else.
Hmm.
And almost immediately what I say back to the person is, if a friend came to you, would you feel like they were being a burden on you? And of course the answer is no.
Mm-hmm.
Or they'll be like, well, it depends on the friend. Like, it could be like, and they'll get kind of intellectual with it or something. But, it's just funny how we totally, and I think we do that, like human beings do that in so many ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, Keith, like if I saw a guy that kind of looked like me walking down the street, I would be like, oh, he's not that overweight, But then when I live in my body, I'm like, oh, Kipp, I'm kind of fat,
Everyone's harder on themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's like the same thing emotionally. Like, oh, I'll support other people, but I don't want to bring anybody else down, And so a big part of that is helping people recognize that they're allowed to take up emotional space in other people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
And what I always tell them is like, I'm like, hey, I've got a really good eye for that. If I feel like you're overdoing it, I'll tell you. And I was like, you got to trust me. One of the good things about the relationship is I'm not their friend.
Yeah.
I'm their psychologist, or I'm their counselor, or their therapist, or whatever. So for me, my job is to give them feedback, be honest, and like support them. And like, sometimes supporting them is challenging them, and sometimes supporting them is validating them. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like I got way off track from what you originally
No, I
asked
just like
me.
that comment, like I'm not their friend. Do you ever feel like that's tough? Like you talk to somebody you like a lot, and you have to like.
Oh yeah, that's such an awesome topic. Yeah.
So what's that like?
Keith,
What's that like?
There has literally been times where I've been like, I wish I didn't meet you in this way, because I like would love to just like hang out with you. And this is where a tricky thing in therapy too, Keith, because sometimes people will come in and they're so similar to me, or they have such similar interests that it's almost like I could spend like, oh hey, let's talk about dude, I have so many clients that love podcasts.
Yeah.
And so like they'll be like, oh, did you listen to Joe Rogan this week? Because they know I like podcasts. And I'm like, yeah, did you? Like, what'd you think about this? And then you're like, okay, well, we've only got 50 minutes, so I actually, like, you have to be able to catch your own. That's it's like what we call transference, right? It's when you are getting something out of the therapy when the client should be, It's actually going to start counter-transference. So you have to be, or I have to be very aware of that with myself, that this is for me and this is enjoyable for me, and it's also the client trying to do something for you and like entertain you a little bit, and sometimes it can be because they're trying to avoid things, or sometimes it can be because they just feel like it's polite,
Yeah.
But I like it. I like that part. Like, I have lots of stuff in my office, like lots of video game stuff and like interesting little like nerdy, geeky trinkets and stuff. Yeah. So a lot of times that helps like start the conversation, but I've definitely experienced it where people are like, let's just talk about Pokemon, and I'm like, okay, like we talked about Pokemon for a little bit. Let's get back to, depression or anxiety or whatever. But yeah, tons of time. And Keith, on the other hand, there's also times where you counsel people you really wouldn't like. And
is it tough to, you kind of have to kind of pretend, I guess, that you have some, I don't know.
Well, I would say if you pretend, you're going to come off as really disingenuous. So the key is to find, like, did you ever read Ender's Game, Keith?
Oh, I was 17, it was a long time ago.
Okay, there's a sequel to Ender's Game. Ender's Game is a book, for those that don't know. It's a kind of a sci-fi book. It's by God, who wrote that book?
Is it like I don't know, say Anderson or something? Or
Orson Scott Card. Yeah, wrote that book. And basically in the sequel, which is called Speaker for the Dead, Ender he's doing basically like a eulogy for this guy who was like a terrible person. And he says, like, when you truly know your enemy, you like learn to love them. And he's like, so he does all this research to like understand this like really terrible person, and then he like kind of finds like compassion for that person. And I would say that's like the same mission when you work with a client that you don't necessarily like, you wouldn't have been friends with, or if you met them at a bar or something, you'd kind of be like, oh, this guy is kind of weird, or like, get away from me, or like, no, I wouldn't do like, or like Keith, like a person who's like very superficial. And obviously, like as a counselor, you are inherently, like kind of a deep person. So you don't appreciate like talking about the Kardashians or whatever, it's not interesting. And so you have to be able to break through that and like find some commonality or something to have empathy around. I'll tell you one for me, Keith, because I grew up like kind of poor. It's like very wealthy people I have a hard time with.
What is that like?
So if somebody...
Well, first of all, how do you know? How do you know?
Well, because I'll ask them, like, what are your parents... How's your relationship with your parents? What do your parents do for a living? Okay. And if, their dad is a hedge fund manager... Okay. And their mom is like, oh, and she is a housewife, you're kind of like, okay, like I kind of see the story here. Yeah. Or, like there's a lot of little social class, like, implication, like ways you can pick up on that, I think, sometimes with people, like, oh, hey, you're going to Cancun and you don't have a job. So there's like, obviously, like, how did you pay for that? And they're like, well, like, oh, I have scholarships. I'm like, oh, so your scholarships paid for your trip to, you know what I mean? Yeah, they'll never say it directly always, but you can kind of pick up on that. So for me, I internally have to recognize that that's not about them. That's my bullshit. I have to recognize that that's my jealousy and my anger and my like feelings of injustice and, resentment for having to struggle, And if I let all that stuff get in the way, I'm a bad psychologist, I would say. So it's my job to recognize that. And then, I almost feel like you have to kind of overcompensate a little bit. You don't want to overcompensate too much where you're like working extra hard for that person.
Do you feel like at some point though too, like ideally you are being, I don't know, like everybody like interacts with one another and you try to read someone for truth, either in what they say or in their face. So maybe somebody is polite to you, but you can tell in their face that they feel differently than what they've said. And you use that information to like adjust your behavior. So, I mean, is it even possible if somebody, say, has a really great life and comes from a well-off family, but they're 19 and they're depressed, which isn't that unusual, and maybe not clinically depressed, but they're just a bit blue, and they're talking to you, and you're trying to like be not subjective, but maybe they can see past that, and they realize like, oh, this person is not very impressed by my sadness because of my situation in life. I mean, in a way, is that good? Like maybe it's a positive thing for them to see the reality that's there, because then they have to deal with that. Like, oh wow, maybe my circumstances aren't so bad, or is that just not your role? I guess.
Keith, I can't say I've ever had somebody do that. I think what happens is actually that becomes kind of so depression is full of paradoxes. So I'll give you an example. Like, I don't want to be a burden on somebody, so I'm not going to ask for help. The less I ask for help, the worse I feel. The worse I feel, I don't want to be a burden on somebody. So it becomes like this downward cycle. Another one, basically what you just said, is people feel like, well, people have it worse than me. So then they go, well, I don't need to, like, I've actually had people be like, well, I don't want to take up an hour. There's probably somebody who needs this hour more than I do. So, that becomes like another one of those paradoxes. You view yourself, because what you're really saying to yourself when you say that is, I'm weak.
Why?
Well, because you're saying, for me, because people have it worse than me, and I'm come from this super privileged background, and I can't tolerate whatever, like my chemistry class. Clearly, I'm a weaker human being than these people who have to work 3 jobs and are in the chemistry class.
I see.
So it becomes this paradox where you are shaming yourself for feeling bad. And that's a classic recipe for depression.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Just, because you're just calling yourself, you're making fun of yourself.
Yeah. What do you? I mean, who do you think counseling is for? Do you think it's for? I had a psychology teacher when I was in high school who I liked quite a bit, and I remember her in one class saying something about how she thought everyone should have a therapist or a counselor because, according to her, it was just like should be a staple of mental health because everybody has problems.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter who you are, everybody has problems. And I thought that made a lot of sense. And then I remember later in the day after lunch talking to this guy who was like a football player and not really a friend of mine, but a guy I knew. And he was like, yeah, that class is okay, but I thought it was kind of dumb how she said everyone should have a therapist. I don't know about that. Like it was almost like stigmatizing or something. Like he didn't want that. And that stuck with me. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Oh, that's really tough for me to say, Keith, because it's like, I think people pull the effects of therapy from a lot of different things. So I don't think, like, kind of like what you said, the sage person or whatever, like, let me ask you this, Keith. What do you think would be more effective if you were feeling depressed? Coming to counseling for 5 weeks or going camping at Big Sur, California for 5 weeks?
Big Sur. I guess it would depend, but probably Big Sur.
Right, because you would like get out of your monotony. You would like realize some stuff about yourself. You would like feel a sense of freedom. Like both are therapeutic, right? Which, if we define therapeutic as you feel better than what you do now, there's something healing, right? And so counseling is a way of getting that. But I also would say that, Keith, would everybody benefit from running? Yeah. You know what I mean? Would everybody benefit from lifting weights? In my opinion, yes. Would everybody benefit from taking a intro to psychology class? Probably. Or intro to sociology class and like being a little bit more critical of the world? Absolutely. So would everybody benefit from going to counseling? Probably, but it would depend to what degree. And I think it depends on the counselor. Would everybody on the planet benefit from coming to me? Hell no. Like, of course not, right? Like, Keith, right now, even though I'm trained in everything, there would be a subset of the population that would probably do better with you as a counselor than me, even though you have no training, right? Just because they would like you better, or you would remind them less of their brother.
Whatever it is, yeah.
Whatever kind of, like whatever, or they like your glasses, whatever. Like, or they like that you're softer spoken than I am,
Did you tell me one time that, like, the main thing that really, I don't know who established this, but the thing that really matters when it comes to the success of a client is simply whether they like the counselor?
Yeah. Right, like and trust. Yeah, it's a controversial subject in psychology, so there's been a divide in the field where some people believe it's all about, like, using the most effective methods. And so there's these certain types of therapy, we call them cognitive behavioral therapies, and they are kind of like the benchmark for therapy, right? And the people who believe that they're taught to like use a manual, and you follow the manual with the client. So if they have depression, you pull out the depression manual, you follow it, you get a little bit of leniency. You can go this way or you can go that way with it, but for the most part, you should follow the manual. You should build a relationship with them. And if you do a good job with the manual, the person's depression will go away. Or it's the highest likelihood that their depression will go away. The other school of thought believes that, based on some meta-analyses that were done, for those that don't know, a meta-analysis is when you take a bunch of benchmark study, when you take a bunch of research studies and you kind of jam them all into a bigger study and look at like what the collective effects are. So instead of looking at like one depression study, you look at 50 depression studies, and then you say like, what have we learned from these 50 together?
Mm-hmm.
And so some of those meta-analyses have found that it really doesn't matter whether or not the like therapist uses this approach or that approach, or they follow this manual or that manual. And all that matters is like whether or not the relationship is good.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually doesn't even matter if the counselor thinks the relationship's good. It's actually whether the client thinks the relationship's good.
Mm.
And so that's kind of it's kind of interesting because people don't like that perspective because it feels, I think, on one hand, too easy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then the other hand, I think it feels too slippery from a scientific perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it doesn't really matter what you do. It's just like getting the person to like you.
Yeah.
So, but what the people who advocate for that view, and these are like hardcore scientists too. This is not like the touchy-feely people, right? Like probably the most hardcore scientist in all of psychology is the guy who figured this out. You know, his name's Bruce Wampold. He's at the University of Wisconsin. He's like an accountant. The guy.
Really?
Like, he was a math major in undergrad.
I think it's really interesting when someone transitions like that from one field to another. That's like polar opposites.
Yeah, and so he just found that like what we should be teaching people is how to build relationships, and if you know how to do that, you're gonna like increase the likelihood of people getting better. So it's just kind of a war that's been waging in psychology between like the kind of the manualized treatments. The thing is though is the insurance companies really like the manualized treatments because then you can say this is going to take 9 sessions. You know what I mean? And they really like that you can kind of quantify the work.
Yeah.
Versus, you know, if you think about like I would say a classic example of the other therapies, if you've seen Good Will Hunting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like Robin Williams is just like all about building a relationship. He's not like using a manualized treatment at all.
Yeah.
You know, and so he's like, if I can do the silent, not break the silence first, like I'm gonna gain his respect.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. Huh.
You know, or like, you know, I'm gonna like make friends with him and talk about farting and you know, tell him stories and you know.
It's really interesting.
So.
There was one.
That movie's a reason a lot of people want to be a therapist, by the way.
That makes sense too. It's a great movie. It's a classic movie. I was going to ask you, do you feel like in some ways you are now like immune to counseling because you know the tricks of the trade? Like, would it be possible for you to sit down with a counselor and actually have them counsel you and have it be helpful?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think so. Like, I don't think I'm immune. I think that would depend on my own level of my own ego and my own narcissism in that moment. You know, so I think I'm the type of person that I am susceptible to having my ego inflated, you know? And so I think I can totally see, like, if I was in the kind of mood where it was like, well, I know better, I know what they're trying to do, and, like, I wasn't allowing them to do their job, sure, it would be, like, hard, but, like, I hope that I'm insightful enough to be like, that's just my BS, you know? Like, that's me trying to feel important and smart and not, like, actually, you know, let the treatment work or, like, let myself, like, gain insight from this process. But on the other hand of it, I would say that it's you can likely see the tricks that the person is trying, which I think creates maybe like a sense of could create a sense of like disingenuousness.
That makes sense. Like, that makes perfect sense.
You know, like because you're like I know what you're doing.
They would have to do like they would have to have the Robin Williams approach. You'd have to be like Matt Damon.
Yeah. Can I go off that a little bit, Keith? Actually, the other thing that I think a lot of people think is that I'm not like susceptible to depression or anxiety, and it's like it's almost like more infuriating because I'm still a person who gets anxious, you know. And it's like I've gotten better because I've learned all this stuff, but I'm definitely not immune to it, and sometimes in a weird way it like sneaks up on me more because I think I got a handle on it, right? And so then all of a sudden it'll like kind of sneak up on me and I'll be like, oh shit, like I didn't think I was that upset about that, you know, and then it'll surprise me a little bit. And so, yeah, I really have to be vigilant around my, like, what we call, like, self-care. You know, I got to make sure that I'm doing it pretty consistently. So for me, a big one is, like, I run every day. And that, to me, is, like, it serves a lot of purposes. I think it serves, like, a physiological purpose, obviously. But it also serves kind of a psychological purpose in, like, being away from the therapy office and being able to, like, move and being able to interact with people. Like, a huge part of it for me, Keith, is, like, okay, so first of all, there's not very many extroverted therapists.
You're one of the few.
Like, like, most therapists are super introverted. Yeah. And, like, if you talk a little bit, it's like, whoa, you're, like, super extroverted. But I'm, like, crazy extroverted, you know? So I'm a weirdo, right? So for me, at the end of the day, I'm, like, starving for regular human interaction.
Outside of the counseling center.
Well, because it's listening. You know, it's like 90% of my job.
Yeah, no,
is
that makes
listening,
sense.
which
That makes
I
perfect
enjoy.
sense.
But so sometimes I tell my girlfriend, I'm just like, can we just go to Target? I just need to, like, be around people, and I just need to, like, kind of soak up that energy again. You know? Oh, that's hard. I struggle with that, like, bad. Like, if I'm just, or I'll, like, want to call one of my friends when I leave work just because I like to just talk and, like, be normal and be able to talk about myself. It's a weird thing to spend, like, 7 hours listening to some people. You know what I mean?
And it's probably not an easy thing to combine, but, like, if you were running with other people or doing some sort of week exercise, like, you know, once a week, some sort of exercise with a group of people, like every Wednesday morning for a little while, I would go down to the steps in the art museum in Philadelphia where Rocky runs up those steps in the movie, and just exercise with a group of people before work, like strangers, you know, maybe 40 people will show up, and we're all led and just push-ups and running up and down the stairs and that kind of thing. But people, like, hang out and tell jokes and they get to know each other. I think something like that might be
totally
fun for you.
Yeah, it's just hard. I mean, I work I work a lot, and so it's really hard for me to, like, have a lot of free time where, and I think this is true for anybody who works kind of like I work a salaried job, so it's, you know, and it's a professional job, so you end up. Oh, that's it here though. Let me, like, forget what I was saying just now. You know, it's another part of therapy that, like, nobody probably thinks about is just the insane amount of paperwork. Yeah, because, like, every time you see somebody, every time you get an email, every time you talk to somebody, every time you consult with somebody, you have to write down what happened. And it's like, the thing is like, the more stressful the clinical situation, the more you have to write. So there's actually been times in counseling where I'm, like, doing something, like, whether I'm on the phone with somebody, and I'm, like, just, like, dreading, because I'm knowing as the person's saying something, I'm like, wow, I'm going to have to write so much, you know?
Man, that's, like, the modern era. Like, that's, like, such a classic, like, modern problem of just, like, and, like, in the same moment that there's, like, a real human thing happening, the other party is just like, fuck, I have to deal with the bureaucracy.
Is, like, and that it's so dumb, and, you know, it just feels like it could be replaced, or, you know, if we could just speak our notes, or it'd be even cooler if you could just have all the sessions recorded and they would just go into a database somewhere, you know? But it's, we're still at the point of, like, every time somebody leaves, I have to write up, like, basically half a page, you know, and it's like, you know, and I could just, if I could find a person that would just do that for me, I would pay them half my salary, because it would just, it's such a burden. So
I need a job. Yeah,
well,
maybe I could do that.
Great. I'll hire you, and are you good at keeping secrets? So. All right.
Yeah, actually.
This, so, anyway, I don't know, Keith. Anything? I mean, I feel like I taught. This has been kind of a weird podcast because I feel like
I feel like this was actually this was kind of a counseling session, and I was your counselor.
Yeah, that's true.
This is my foray into counseling.
How'd I do? I mean, what's the diagnosis? Why is the diagnosis?
I think you did great. Well, you tell me. You tell me. How did I do? I feel like you got a lot of great stuff out.
Feel like a counseling session. I guess I would say you did a good job. Right. So
there we go.
That's my marker of success, you know. Yeah. So Keith, just to take, you know, I want to do this new thing that I think I want to call, like, I don't know if we have official title for it, but I want to call it something like Midwestern Stories. And
Midwestern
yeah, and
stories. It sounds
Midwestern
nice.
Stories, and it's just like I want to look at like some kind of like funny news articles that have come out of the Midwest, and I want to pick different.
The
I want to
tragedies
pick
and
different
tribulations
things
of
each
the
week
Midwesterners.
that are like from different states within the Midwest. So I don't know if I'll be able to totally do it. So we're gonna try it. I have a news story today that I wanted to tell you about. I'm gonna give you the title first, okay, Keith? And I just want you to react. We're gonna take this piece by piece and kind of riff off it as we go, okay?
All
The
right, lay it on
headline
me.
is Knife-wielding intruder allegedly tells victim, "You're going to smoke some weed with me right now."
Oh,
So,
jeez. And this is Midway. Yeah, this sounds like it would either be in Florida or like Michigan,
yeah.
like one or the
Let
other,
me start
though.
off. A man in Cadillac, Michigan, had a shocking wake-up call early Wednesday when a knife-wielding intruder insisted that they get high together, police say.
I mean, in fairness, if a knife wielding intruder is gonna come at you, like that's the best thing they could say.
It's so funny. It's almost like a dare class gone awry. You know, it's like, what if somebody holds a gun to your head and tells you smoke weed? It's like the smart ass kid in class. If a person holds a gun to you, should you smoke weed? You know.
I wonder if it was like a teenager on a dare, or
No,
what
I mean,
the
there's
deal
a
was,
picture
what the
of
situation
it's a guy.
was.
I mean, it's a man.
It's like it's a man, it's a grown man.
So the funny thing about it is, it's almost like what would cause that? It's like he feels so guilty about smoking weed that he's like, you're gonna do it too. Like he takes like the goody two shoes person he knows and he like makes him do something bad.
Maybe he was just really sad. Maybe he didn't have anybody to smoke with, and he was like, I can't stand it
God.
anymore.
So okay, the unidentified man was sleeping on his couch around 2:30 a.m. when another man woke him up and allegedly said, "You're going to smoke some weed with me right now," according to Fox 17 News. Cadillac Police Detective Todd Golnick. Oh, can't you just picture him? Oh yeah, old Todd Golnick was over there talking to him. Told the guy was threatening him, told him to smoke some reefer. He was going to shank him up there. And where was that at? Well, that was up in Cadillac. You know. So, let's see. According to police, the victim managed to stall the forced pot smoking until the attacker put the knife down.
Jeez.
So how would you imagine that conversation? Okay, Keith, you're gonna smoke some weed with me right now. I've got a knife. How would you stall me?
I have no idea. I think I would pretend to smoke and just like blow it out without inhaling.
So
That'd be my
funny.
strategy.
Like imagine you're like, I do smoke, dude, but I only do it through a vape. Do you have vape? Do you have a vape, man? So, according to police, the victim managed to stall. Okay, yeah. Until at that point, the victim grabbed the weapon and ran to the next home, where he banged on the door. Golnick said the neighbor, unaware of what happened next door and fearing his own home was being invaded, called 911. Police were then dispatched to the scene. It's been a bit confusing, but the officers saw a man carrying a knife walking toward them and thought it was the invader, Golnick said. But it was the victim, and he quickly explained what had happened in his house.
I really wonder about that guy, like the perpetrator, you know? Like if he was on just some other bizarre drug. I don't think anybody would do that high. Maybe if he was drunk or something.
Oh my god. It's just like such a ridiculous like thought process to like what
I kind of want to know what their life is like, though. You know,
Yeah.
how do they get to that point in their life where they're breaking into someone's home with a knife and asking them to get high
Well,
with
and
them?
it's not clear whether they knew each other or not. Like I want to know if this guy knew the guy who he broke into his house to make him smoke weed, you know? Like was he like did they have some kind of relationship before this, or was there like a texting conversation like, "Hey man, like you mind if I come over and we smoke up?" "Dude, don't come over. You're going to smoke with me, man."
What if they were like best friends and this is just the victim's way of getting back?
Right.
Because he's not really a victim
Right,
at all.
that could be. Yeah, I could see that. So, let's see where there's one more quote. This was different because, Goldnick said it appears the two men were neighbors, but did not know one another. He told, there you go. So he told Cadillac News that break-ins where an intruder is intoxicated or just looking for a place to sleep happen a few times a year, but this one was extreme. And then there's a quote. This was different because he was armed and engaged the first person he saw with an extremely bizarre request, he told the paper. This was extremely random, and we don't know what was really going on with this guy. He hasn't cooperated to let us know what his intent really was. So anyway, he hasn't cooperated, which is unfortunate. But
good old Michigan.
Anyway, that's the top news from Cadillac, Michigan, which is in the upper part of the hand, a little bit north of.
There was like two gunshots that I didn't hear from my home, but I guess like a little bit south, a couple blocks from where I'm at. And I read about it on Reddit, on Philly's Reddit page. It was like, because people, when they hear gunshots, they'll go on Reddit and they'll be like, did anybody hear gunshots? I live around, this street and this street. Did anybody else hear them?
Yeah.
And other people be like, yeah, I heard them, but I didn't hear any cop sirens and stuff like that. And then the next day, which was today or was it yesterday? I forget. I read these two boys were killed. These two teenage boys were killed. There was some kind of skirmish.
Whoa.
And somebody started shooting. And they went to like some prep school or something. They were like, I don't know, just kids. And it was just crazy that was not that far away from where I'm at. So that's the contrast between Philly and Michigan. They'll attack you and make you get high.
Yeah.
Philly, you just get shot.
Yeah. Did you also hear about the kids that are being prosecuted for murder in Flint?
No.
Because they threw rocks off of a what do you call it?
Oh, overstay. Yeah,
and actually killed somebody.
Is this recent or a long time ago?
I don't know. I think it's. Let me see.
I heard about something like that a long time ago.
Did you? I think I just saw it was recent, actually.
I'm sure that happens from time to time.
Well, let's see. It was posted October 24th. Yeah. No, this is brand new.
Yeah.
October 23rd. It says. So this just happened. There's like an interview, and I guess they were throwing all kinds of rocks off there. And yeah, this 32-year-old guy, he was like a dad, got murdered.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just terrifying. Ugh. But anyway, we're gonna stick to the fun stories, like the guys breaking in telling people to smoke weed on Midwestern stories. So, anyway, Keith, that's I think enough for our show at this point. So I think that concludes.
Yeah, it's an awkward ending, but it's an ending nevertheless.
It's an ending nevertheless. So that's going to be the end of episode 48.
48.
Keith, we're almost to 50. How do you feel about that?
I'm all right with that.
That was a therapist question, wasn't it? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I feel like 100 is like the big. So yeah, like 50 is kind of like, oh yeah, I don't know.
Really? I kind of feel like 50 is pretty impressive. I mean, it's 50 hours of you and I talk. It's probably more like 60 hours of us talking with.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah.
So I'm pretty excited about it. Keith, I don't want to make any promises, but I would love to do that episode live.
How would that work?
Like we could do it on like Facebook Live, or we could do it on like Twitch or something like that.
Twitch. All right, we could talk about that.
Yeah, I just think that'd be neat, and then people could like interact with us, kind of like on the we could talk about something, and then people could like pose questions and stuff. I think that'd be really fun.
Yeah, that might be fun.
So I guess if you're interested in that, tweet us, or email us, or Facebook us, or I don't know, all that stuff that we do. So, all right, everybody, I'm Dr. Kipp Petrantonio.
This is Keith McIntosh.
Have a good day.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed the show, check out Kipp and Keith on Facebook at Midwestern Social Scientists. You can also tweet them at #Midwestern Social Scientists. Or you can check out their Podomatic page, which is the first place the episodes get released. Don't miss out. Yeah, just check out their Facebook, okay? Thanks.